You notice how it says it here in verse 8, and he'd been crippled from his mother's womb, who never had walked. And when he healed him, look at verse 10, said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet. And he leaped. He didn't just say, but he leaped. And the man that Peter healed, it said he leaped up and down and held them.
And notice the response. This gets interesting. It tells us something about, clearly Barnabas is the senior companion. But we learn something in verses 11 and 12 about who is probably doing most of the talking. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. And they call Barnabas Jupiter, meaning Zeus. And they call Paul Mercurius, meaning Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Why call him Hermes? Hermes was the herald of the gods. He was the spokesman for the gods. And so it sounds like Paul is doing most of the talking.
I've wondered, too, when you see statues of Hermes, which we saw a lot of them when we were in Turkey, he's always young. Mm-hmm. And Zeus and Jupiter is always old. And I'm wondering if Paul at this time is younger than Barnabas.
Well, I think that probably is the case. Well. Barnabas is an older, more experienced, seasoned veteran in the church. Paul is a young missionary.
He's Paul's mentor.
And they do think they're God. They want to offer sacrifices to them with garlands and at the gates, and would have done sacrifice, but they run out and prevent them. Verse 15, we are men of like passions with you. We're just common men. But I like verse 18. Even after telling them, don't offer sacrifice, we're just men like you, even with these sayings, scarce restrained they the people that they had not done sacrifice unto them. And yet there's another group in the very next verse who want to kill him, and in fact do.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul is about 40 years old at this time. His first mission is about 45, 46 A.D. And Paul was born about 5 A.D. So, young man.
Really young man.
Really young.
Pretty young.
Chapter 15. Perhaps one of the most important chapters in the New Testament in terms of the growth, the spread, and some of the challenges of the church. Verse 1 indicates, certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. As Brother Matthews mentioned in a previous session, when we see the word circumcision, often it just simply is a code word for the law of Moses. What do we call these folks who continue to push, though members of the church, though Christians, continue to push for the perpetuation of the law of Moses? What do we call them?
The Judaizers?
The Judaizers. And so a group of Judaizers have come and began to say, no, you've got to live the law of Moses. And so this is the issue that then begins to come up.
Now, they've come from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, on a map, it's up. Geographically, it's down. Mm-hmm. So that's why it says they came down. But it's rather interesting.
Everything is down from Jerusalem.
That's correct.
I just find that interesting, too, that Joseph Smith, in translating the Book of Mormon, though he'd never been to Israel, never missed that when he describes up to Jerusalem and down from Jerusalem.
Bob, just a thought here. I've often thought that these sort of self-proclaimed church leaders, these Judaizers, I've often thought that perhaps together they in talking and hearing about the success that Paul and Barnabas have had, the growth in Antioch, maybe they're thinking things are getting out of hand here. We've got a lot of Gentiles coming into the church. They're not living the law of Moses. And
we're losing the old church like we knew it before.
Yeah, and we need to get a grip on it again. And
so what happens? Paul and Barnabas are sent to Jerusalem to try to get a reading on this from the leadership of the church, right? Now, I want to pause in the action here in this account and have us, if we could, flip over to the second chapter of Galatians. We've often said Acts has great history and the epistles have great doctrine, and the only problem with that is that's not accurate. Because Acts has great doctrine and the epistles have pretty good history. And so look in chapter 2. Jeff, if you'd read for us, starting in chapter 2 of Galatians, start with verse 1 and go through verse 4.
Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation, and communicated unto them that the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage.
2 more verses, if you will.
To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But of these who seemed to be somewhat whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person, for they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me.
Let's go back and look at this. Notice some of the great points that he's making here. If Saul's conversion is in approximately, 35 AD, Bob? Is that about right?
Yes, I think so.
About 35 AD. 14 years after that, that means that this conference we're going to hold at Jerusalem, the Jerusalem conference, is taking place in about 49 AD.
49 AD. Mm-hmm.
So 14 years after that, he's describing, I go back. Notice what he says in verse 2 about how he goes back. He knows how to set up all his ducks in a row. I went up by revelation, communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation. Lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. What did he just say?
He's saying, I went to see the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency before the conference was held.
So that we could make sure we were on the same page.
Yeah.
And
he took Exhibit A, who was Titus.
Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Another way of saying that is, but we did not compel Titus to be circumcised.
Now this is good to establish too. He's not going to try and establish doctrine. He wants to get a read on what the doctrine. This is an issue that's been raised up. Let's just get a clarification.
Here's a case, and maybe we're bringing it up prematurely, but here's a case. I remember learning this in Brother Matthew's class years ago. He's bringing Titus as a case study. He's bringing him uncircumcised. Now later, in the 16th chapter, he takes Timothy, and what does he do? One of the first things he does before they leave on their mission? He gets him circumcised. Why, Bob?
It's the problem of it's one thing to have a revelation and establish a doctrine. It's another thing to get people to accept it, and you've got to get people to listen to you first.